we're joined by a special guest, Jim Halford, and today we're just going to really discuss kind of zero-till, what led to Conserva Pak, and basically the way we farm today. So Jim, yeah, I guess what's some of the history behind Conserva Pak and zero-till, and what led to, I guess, the creation of it?
Well, probably the thing that pushed me to looking into a different way of farming was where we farm, which is in a valley that had problems from both wind and water erosion. We have fence lines that you could still find fences buried completely under from the 1930s. And then we had washouts from the side hill fields from heavy rains that would occur and with bare fields. So we had to look at a different way of farming. And another thing is we had a little bit of salinity here and there, and realized that if we could keep that land cropped every year and not disturb it too much, we could reduce the salinity somewhat, or at least not let it get any worse. So there was a lot of reasons why we really got into looking at the system. And we started in the first thing in 1979, which was with a disc drill that I bought, a Haybuster disc drill from US, and used that for 4 years. After about 3 years, I realized we had to start looking at something else, because the disc drill on our type of soils was just wearing out discs and bearings, and it also could only put seed and fertilizer together. It had no way of separating the fertilizer. So that's kind of where we started. And maybe I should indicate that the soils we're on, there's a lot of them in Western Canada. It's primarily called oxbow loam. And in southeast Saskatchewan, there's something like 9 million acres or more of it. And in our particular case, a lot of our land has 50% sand and about 15–16% clay. So it's not a heavy soil. And then we have soils that are even close to 100% sand. So that's the type of soils we have to work with.
Yeah, that's interesting. So then, I guess where did you, I guess, start all your testing? Was it kind of on your farm or kind of all over?
Yeah, I always said it was probably useful that we were kind of away from most traffic, because it was easy to do things. It was out of the norm, because you didn't have to worry so much about what they were talking about in the coffee shop. So yes, it was on our own farm, and we tried things with the disc drill to try to make things work, but I became very frustrated with that when I was trying to even use it for putting down fertilizer in the fall, and realizing I was just wearing the machine out some more, which would require more repairs. And so I became convinced that we had to go to a knife type of an opener, because durability and being able to penetrate, because if the year was dry and warm and soils got hard in the spring, we couldn't even make the disc drill penetrate, even though it was made to go into fairly hard conditions. And so we needed a knife type opener. So that's how we got to where we got. And then of course we realized that there was enough information around then to say there was an advantage to putting fertilizer on when you were seeding, rather than separately banding it or broadcasting, which is of course still the worst method of putting fertilizer on, in my opinion. And so we decided that we wanted something we could fertilize and also seed with, and also pack it in one operation. And that's what led to the real end thing we call the Conserva Pak.
It's interesting. So I guess with the design, with having kind of that separation like that, so what kind of sparked that idea versus, like, I guess the seed shank type opener, or any of those?
Well, we actually tried some other things that were, of course, probably simpler, where you'd have a shank coming down, and then you'd put the fertilizer down, and then we had a little deflector at the back and tried to separate it before the seed came down. But it was too inconsistent in terms of keeping the seed away from the fertilizer. And of course, if you get the seed, particularly of some crops like canola, close to the fertilizer, you're going to have trouble with germination. And so we found that didn't work, and again through experimentation, and then we actually got into trying to come up with an opener. We knew we wanted a packer wheel, so we finally mounted a seat opener further back and to one side, and then we were starting to get pretty consistent separation. And in actual fact, your grandfather was involved in helping me with all that, and we made it work. And sort of one night in fall of '63, I had the grandfather and the former ag rep Vic Bolio come out and have a look, and they agreed we were getting consistent separation. So we built enough for that fall, and seeded winter wheat that way in the fall of '83.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, well, I remember like Grandpa talking about it a lot. Well, just as we got older, kind of thing, about the Conserva Pak and all a lot about it. And yeah, it was pretty cool. Like, I mean, when I was younger, you know, this is a prime one too. I mean, again, I'm not an equipment dealer. I have no say in, you know, whatever. But I remember the year Dad and Uncle Kenny bought a Burgo seeder, and Grandpa came out to the farm, and I asked him, so what do you think? Right? Yeah, just the sheer look of disappointment of, I don't like it. I said, well, why not? He goes, cause, he said, I like the independent opener, and yeah, basically that exact same thing, the separation, and yeah, it was just, and for me, I never really paid attention to it, because I mean, that year, I just started with iHarf, and so I never really paid attention to different types of seeders and stuff, until I actually started working there and doing the trials, and I mean, even in the drier years now, there's a difference between, you know, that Paralink system versus like even a C-shank flexible, for example, and it's showing up more in these dry years than anything.
Well, you're very accurate about that, because we've seen in the last 3 years, which have been dry here, that we think there's fairly significant difference. But I think people maybe are not realizing what all goes on, and they take a look at something that puts the fertilizer in a separate location and fairly distant in the early crop growth stage from where the seed is placed. And if you've got lighter land, and you're particularly over knolls and so on, you'll find that the roots of the new crop take a long time to ever get to where the fertilizer is. Now, if there's lots of moisture around, or you've got fairly highly productive soil all over your fields, then it may not be such a problem. But it's definitely showed up in the last 3 years that we've been able to maintain some pretty good yields. In fact, I consider exceptional yields, considering how little moisture we've had.
For sure.
So there really is a difference, and what we were able to learn and develop and so on was the fact that we could make the system work in quite a range of conditions. And the other type of thing that we wanted to do, that we knew right from the start, was we wanted to have minimal other operations required, and for sure got rid of the fertilizing. But we don't even like to harrow fields, so that backs up to your harvesting, of where you've got to have your combines equipped with proper straw spreading and chaff spreading, which the companies have done a much better job. But in the early days, that was very poor, and we all had to modify equipment to try to get decent straw and chaff spreading. And now with that, if you can possibly get away without harrowing, we definitely recommend it. And on our own farm, well, last year my son Chris harrowed everything we were going to harrow on about 2.5 sections of land in just over half a day.
No, yeah.
All he did was a few low spots here and there, and left everything else alone, and we were very glad we'd done it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I know, like, even with us, like, we have, we seed with the Flexco 5000 on 10-inch spacing. We don't have a heavy harrow, we just have the lighter, I don't even know what brand it is. It's an old Burgo, I think, but we usually get in the habit of harrowing in the fall. Mainly our issue in the spring is if it's damp, we have trouble seeding through it. That's just with the seed shank. I don't know about the other
Well,
ones, but
That's the problem, I think, as to why a lot of the harrowing goes on. And it's unfortunate that some of the companies haven't made more effort to get their equipment so it will go through more residue, because as far as we're concerned, we consider harrowing as just the first start of tillage. And it's a light operation, I realize. But I actually saw last fall where people had harrowed some fields, and a lot of the stubbles weren't that heavy, so we know the crops weren't that heavy. And to actually see soil blowing out of that later on, not just when he's harrowing, but later on, it tells you that, you know, it starts to take you down the road of disturbing the residue and so on. And the more you can leave that residue undisturbed, the better it's going to hold moisture in too.
yeah,
All
sure.
the chaff particularly. And now the combines are getting, so you can spread chaff pretty well with them. And even in windy conditions, and if you can keep the ground pretty well covered, and then just go through and seed with minimal disturbance, you're going to keep more moisture in.
Yeah, that's right, and that kind of goes back to like the older combines. Like if you're a combine with 30-foot header, you might have only been spreading 20, 25 feet.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't know if you remember that old clause.
Yeah.
We used that thing right up until last year. Last year I think was the last year that we used it. So we've had it for what, 10 years? That we
Could be.
gave it to Ryan. And I mean, yeah, the combine were great, but that was the trouble I had with it, is I couldn't get the spread out of it. And mainly that was, anywhere where that combine went, that's where I would focus on harrowing, because same thing, I was picking up a 30-foot swath, but only spreading maybe 15, 20 feet. So then you get these ridges in the field too, so that was more of that.
No, so I would still encourage anybody to take a look at what they're doing at harvest and do what they can to improve that and try to get away from harrowing. And I realize that if you're going to put some granular herbicides on, you may want to have a light harrowing operation just to get them a little bit incorporated so they're not completely exposed to the air. But other than that, like I said, at least our practice is to try to eliminate it. And we also know, because we developed the machine and did a lot of testing, to get it to where it would go through a lot of residue. And we also have recommended that people look and manage the height they cut their crops. Like, we've always had a general rule that if you got a 12-inch spacing machine, that maximum 12 inches in height to your stubble. And of course, when we first started, this is something that everybody's pretty much forgotten today, but we had a big lot of convincing of people that you could go to wider row spacings. I mean, people were seeding often with 6, 7, maybe maximum 8-inch spacings back in the 80s and into the 90s. And so they ever think of going, we went to 9-inch because we had to get through residue. But people believed that they couldn't go any wider and so on. And we had trials done in Australia and in North Dakota and lots in Western Canada with 9 versus 12-inch spacing. And quite a few of the research stations that had our plot seeders had done those comparisons. When they all of a sudden began to realize we had just the same, or if not, in some cases better yields with 12-inch, and of course you could get through residue better, and everybody began to think, well, that's okay. And of course, now today, it's hardly discussed.
Yeah, well, that's right, and I mean, really, that's probably one of the main talked about topic is what is better. There's some growers that, you know, they will only do 12-inch spacing, or they'll only buy a 12-inch space drill. And then there's some where, nope, I only want 10-inch spacing. And I mean, yeah, and trash is a big one, right? Like 12-inch spacing has next to no issues with trash clearance.
Well, some machines still have issues with it, but and therefore they're harrowing. I mean, this is the reason people give me. I mean, we see harrowing going on even in canola stubble, and it isn't cut that high, and I can't understand why. But then I'm just told that, well, they have trouble getting through with machines or whatever. And the other thing that I've been told is that because there's a lot of pre-harvest fungicides put on or pre-harvest Roundup, for weed control, etc., put on, that all those wheels tend to tramp down stubble, and that's the part of the stubble that people have trouble getting through. Because that stuff's laying down and it's full length. Quite often it's just been tramped forward and maybe not harvested. And people have trouble getting through that. So it's another issue that we use some of those practices, but we still don't harrow because of it, because we know we can get through. And the big difference that a lot of other companies haven't recognized, or they've tried and found they couldn't make it work with their design, but basically it's the height and the shape of the shank that makes the difference. And if you look at the height sideways of a cedar, if it's like this or like this, you got a big difference in how you can, what your residue can get through.
Oh, really?
It's that simple, but all you need to do is look at a machine sideways and you can pretty soon see the difference in machines, and where some of them, once they're in the ground, they're pretty darn low to the ground. And so they haven't got much room for residue to lift up, which it's going to do, and then starts blocking.
And it basically just creates this drag after.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Because I remember even back when I worked at iHeart, like Guy Lafon used to get so mad at us if we would go out and harrow, and that's why. But I remember we had, it was, I mean, again, at that time I didn't know, it was just common practice for us. We just go harrow.
Yeah.
And he used to just get livid about us going out there with a harrow.
Well, we always used to say it was because guys didn't want to do whatever their wife had for them to do.
Yeah.
So they needed to go harrowing.
It's kind of like picking rocks.
Yeah, so those are some of the things we worked around. And I mean, we worked in situations in Australia and in Eastern Australia and in the Pacific Northwest, like Washington, Oregon, and so on. And those areas, there is times when they grow 100 bushel to the acre wheat crops, or more. I've seen 130 bushels in Australia.
Hopefully.
And it's a winter wheat type of crop. They seed it in the fall and so on. But they've got that kind of stubble to deal with. And some of them, to get around the problem, have used mowers rather than harrows. And they'll cut the stubble down. They may combine it higher, but then they'll cut it lower with a mower. And that's part of the reason why some companies have got up to selling 30-foot mowers.
Yeah.
Because you can manage residue that way. And interestingly, in Australia, where some of them grow these better crops, and you suggest that, some will say, yeah, except it's a fire risk. And it is over there, because if you hit a stone with the blades, you can create sparks and they can have a fire. It's next to no problem in, Pacific Northwest does it all the time in the fall, and they don't have that kind of issue. At least they haven't told me about them.
Yeah.
So, so people have to deal with residue, have looked at different options. And we have all mowed in some cases too. And I do some of that rather than harrowing. And again, we'll only do like your low, heavy residue areas in, say, slough areas.
Oh, yeah.
We're growing a big crop, some of it may be leaning down. We'll go in and mow it, and we only have a 15-foot mower, but we mow around all of our fields anyway, so when I'm out there, I'll go and look in those fields and
Clean up those low spots.
clean up the low spots and leave the rest of it alone.
Well, that makes sense too, because you're going to the low, and basically all you're doing is you're breaking up that straw to allow you to seed into it the next year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So residue management is still something that, well, a lot in Western Canada haven't adapted some of these things that have been done elsewhere. I think it could still be done. A lot of it could be done. And they're pretty good options. It's way better to have a mower and get your stuff spread pretty well with a mower than it is to me to start harrowing.
Yeah.
Harrowing's a quick, easy way, and you can make the fields look pretty nice with GPS and everything now, but I think you need to still, in a lot of cases, stop and think about whether it's really necessary. And like I said, I've had to convince my son about it, but he also believes in it now. And will be one of the first to comment when you see people out with harrows in the fall, especially in fields that, like last year where there was not heavy residue because they had to cut it short anyway because crops were short. There's just no reason unless, like I said, maybe you're trying to put herbicides on or something.
Yeah, so like, I guess back to the Conserva back then, so like when you were doing trials with it, like I guess I'm assuming you worked quite a bit with the research farm and all of them and kind of do all those trials there.
Yeah, we had involvement all over Western Canada. And then in 1993, I was requested by an Ag Canada employee who was at Fort Vermilion, Alberta. And if you don't know where that is, it's an hour from the Northwest Territories, so it's away north in the Peace River. He was convinced to do any zero-till work, you needed proper equipment, and he felt our design was correct. And so we started building plot seeders that were basically 12 feet wide. And we built probably 20 or more of them. Various Ag Canada stations have had them for years, like George Clayton that had encouraged me to do that at Fort Vermilion. I think that machine is still up there, even though the Ag Canada doesn't have a station anymore, but they have a small conservation group of their own. But then Beaver Lodge and Lacombe and so on, got them in Alberta, and now there's probably a couple at Lethbridge, I think, and Indian Head has one, and then Melfort has a couple, and so on. So we had plot seeders that then researchers were doing work, and a lot of them compared 9 and 12-inch spacing. That was probably a good thing, because when they were able to demonstrate that 12-inch worked as well as 9, then there was a lot more interest in the 12-inch spacing, and I think it helped advance people into accepting that idea. And I always remember in disease issues that early on when we were doing work, we had herbicide companies want us to try different things, and we also had fungicides were starting to be used. And I always remember the person, I can't remember the name or the company even anymore, but they wanted us to try a fungicide on a particular crop, and then they came and saw the field and said, oh, you got 12-inch spacing, well, this will probably hard to work here. Because they realized that with the wider rows, the air gets down between the crop better, and you have less disease transmission and so on.
Right, yeah.
And so again, we've probably benefited from that, even though people are using fungicides and so on. We're probably having less issues, especially with some crops, than we would have if people were still at the 9-inch or less.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, as you start closing that canopy in, and I mean, you get the right conditions. All it takes is strong humidity and stuff to get in there too. Yeah. And if you don't get that wind through there, yeah, it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, so anyway, like again, I think we're fortunate that we've got to where we accept the 12-inch spacing pretty generally, and it's a good thing from productivity point of view in Western Canada. Mm-hmm. And of course, when you have 12-inch versus 9-inch, well, you can pull a 40-foot seeder instead of a 30-foot seeder. Yeah. You've got the same number of openers, and you've got to pull them all through the ground, so it's much more efficient that way, and that's why we've been able to have seeders get up to 80-foot size and so on.
Right. So what have you seen, like, comparing the 12-inch and say 10-inch or whatever, like, so you know, with the 12-inch, yeah, we get the more airflow, but what about weed pressure and stuff?
Well, we did enough trials ourselves, because we had trials pretty near every year on our own farm, and at a lot of other places. And our experience with weeds was that 12-inch was no more problem. We thought it would be than a 9-inch, but it wasn't. And I remember Doug Dirksen, when he was here, did quite a bit of observation, because his main focus was weed control, And he recognized this early on, and what we found with plots then is if we got two plots like up to about 14 inches apart, you know, the area between the plots,
Right, yeah.
then we'd start to see weeds. It was strange as anything that it just, once we got so far, then obviously the crop wasn't coming enough into that open area to take the moisture and nutrients away from the weeds.
Right, and then, yeah, because it didn't have that competition in that zone.
Yeah.
Yeah. Huh.
So whether, you know, every farm and every situation, and depending on the weeds too. But one of the early weeds that we had in tillage systems was millet. Well, you hardly talk about millet anymore, because with the zero-till system, any reasonable management, it's just not much of an issue. Why it was such of an issue before was when people were using tillage and tilling the whole field, but then they would always pretty much have to go back with a harrow and a packer to firm it up after all the tillage. And that made a perfect seed bed at the top of the shallow for millet.
Oh, okay.
So millet thrived, and then you saw everybody starting to put sprayers on their harrows and so on to be, you know, spraying either you know, after harvest in the fall, or some would even do it in the spring.
Oh, okay,
So
yeah.
these things all moved around in terms of what people were using, and now you probably hardly have any customers worried about millet.
No, I guess depending on the area, but no, it's pretty
Just
rare.
those light soils that
Yeah.
have had tillage in the past, like
Yeah.
you just switched to.
Yeah, your lighter soils
Yeah.
are definitely
That's
the
where
worst
it's seen.
problem.
Yeah.
And your clay soils, it never was much of an issue.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's kind of gone. And interestingly enough, one of the concerns about zero tillage in the early days was, and I talk about the 80s and 90s as early days, because there wasn't very many doing anything, but some of the negative comments about it was, well, you're going to have all kinds of weed problems. Well, our experience with other farmers, and I think I added up, before we ever marketed our machine, we had something like 180 trials. You went by Ag Canada, ones the university did with our machines, and some of the full-scale machines, and trials that we were doing with farmers or comparisons. And we had early on learned that weeds just weren't nearly the problem everybody expected. And we expected could be problems too, but we knew we had to change our way of farming because of the layout of our land and our soil conditions and all that thing that I explained earlier. But weeds were never the problem that people thought they would be. And some of the main weeds in continuous cropping that had existed then and still could exist today if people didn't manage them is quackgrass and thistles, particularly Canada thistle. And they're still around out there if you're not careful. But we soon found that we could actually get rid of Canada thistle. And people that were using tillage, and when they were using tillage, they were often, during the summer, fall years, using half a dozen tillage operations. Well, they were just dragging it around, and we'd learned too that we could just drag it around and get it going in more places.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, and of course, the advent of Roundup was a great thing. But I have to tell you, it was much more difficult to be trying to control weeds in the 80s and 90s when Roundup was $25 a liter compared to today.
Yeah.
I mean, today it's a lot of the generations probably don't remember that we had to learn zero-till with that as a major problem. And so we had to learn how to get around it. But we basically found we could control quackgrass in 2 or 3 years, and now it's just about non-existent, you know, in our fields.
Yeah, that's right. Unless it's like freshly tilled pasture or something, but I mean, it's not commonly found in field anymore.
Yeah, and like I said, thistles are still there, but there's various things you can use for them. You know, you have broadleaf herbicides as well as Roundup or glyphosate. Yeah, so that's definitely changed over the years, and I'm sure a lot of the fields you will see today are pretty clean. I still think that there is room for people reducing the amount of herbicides they use, and I think the kinds of things that people could use is more spot spraying is probably got some potential, because you probably know some of the weeds, like particular wild oats, which are not going away.
No.
They often occur in specific areas, and if you control them in those areas, you could probably reduce your herbicide bill considerably.
Mm-hmm.
You know, with using that technique. It's not going to be what you can do all the time, but you may be able to find opportunities to do it.
Yeah, and depending on the severity of them too, like, I mean, just adjusting seeding dates, or, you know, trying to get in harvest earlier to get, before those go to seed, can be a big difference too. Just, like you say, management of certain things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know, and kind of with the field, or with the tour stuff, I remember I would have been probably 5 or 6, so probably in the late 90s. I remember going to, you had a field tour out at your farm, and I think you had Jeff, well, you did have Jeff Shane over here, I think, but I don't know if it was, I don't know if they had it on, or you put it on, somebody put it on.
Well, I started the field days in 1987, actually. And
Yeah, that's probably about right.
had a very simple thing every year, because at that stage people were just wanting to see the machine work as much as, but we did have comparisons in crops and so on. And I think it was 90 or 91 that Ag Canada started to get involved, because Doug Dirksen and Guy Lafond by this stage had 4 or 5 years results. And, you know, researchers like to have several years results and replicated trials before they like to say a lot about their results. And so they then got involved, and then I think it was 92 that I say all hell broke loose in terms of interest, because previously we'd had maybe 150 people a previous year come to a field day, and a field day then would be looking around the station for half a day and taking people on buses out to various farms as well as ours. And for the afternoon or something like that. And in 92, all of a sudden with pre-registration, we had 400 people wanted to come. So we had to split into 2 days, because we wanted to keep using the format we had, and for several years we had 2 days in a row. So some of the people making the presentations, because we also broke them into small groups, so when they toured around things, they had an opportunity to ask questions, and it wasn't like 150 people trying to hear and see and so on. So anyway, some of them I think made 12 presentations in 2 days. So anyway, it was an interesting evolution time, and then as zero-till started to be adopted and accepted, then it seemed for a period of years like people thought various places started to think they knew everything about zero-till, and the actual numbers dropped in field days. And then more recently, they've come back again in terms of numbers and interest and so on. And I think some of the reason for coming back is it's been much better times in farming in Western Canada in the last, well, I say the last tough time was 2004. So you can see that's a long run of good years.
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
I mean, some people would have some problems with production or excess moisture or something, but we've actually had an extremely long period of time that I'd never seen previous in all the years I farmed. I started that when I was still at university in 1962, so.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, that's been the evolution sort of field days and information. And now, fortunately, I think a lot of people like yourselves that attend these events, and you get credits and so on, and you're supposed to do a certain amount of this. I think that's very positive, because that gets it out to a lot more people. And certainly, if you added up the acres being covered by people who are with a higher level of knowledge than in previous years, we're definitely gained in that.
Well, and personally, like I said, I mean, yeah, like for our registration and stuff, we need so many hours of credits and stuff. But I mean, really, I go because of the interest, right? Like, you know, whether it's our field day or any of those, I like going because I want to gain interest in new products or new things going on because it's interesting. But yeah, back to I remember at your field day, like I said, it was like 98 or something. I was like 5 or 6. I remember going down with Dad, and that was, like I said, that was the year Jeff Shano was there. And I just remember this man who had this high energy talking about, you know, the trials and stuff. And that stuck with me. Like I said, this man of high energy giving this presentation. And then obviously later on, I was lucky enough to have him as a professor at the U of S too.
Yeah.
And same guy, same energy level. It was pretty cool.
Yeah, we were always fortunate that for the field days that we could get in some people like Jeff. And Jeff was here probably off and on every 3 or 4 years, you know, during that time period. And he was always very good, and everybody paid attention to
Oh
Jeff.
yeah, that's what I mean. Being a 5-year-old kid, that's
and
stuff
he was
with
very
me.
knowledgeable, and we've also been fortunate that, well, he was a fairly recent graduate, around 90 or 91, when he came to our place and first did some research. And they've done research, either him or Agriculture Canada, which involved Saskatoon and Swift Current stations. And 2 years ago, one of Jeff's individuals came out and evaluated our soils, because I'm not sure, a lot of people don't know this, but we've had the measurements on our soils, like I said, after about 12 years, and then 18, 20 years, and then again, well, now we're over 40 years. And they have compared a piece of land that we have that's native land, never been broken, that for whatever reason my father and grandfather left it alone, and it's right close to the longer term fields that we've had, and where Dee's had trials, etc. So we've always had this comparison of the native versus our fields that, well, like I said, over 40 years. And we took over some land that Carry the Cattle Reserve owns and we lease, that we've now had, I think it's 18 or 19 years, well, it'll be 20 years now, that we've actually had crops on it. So we were able to compare it, and it's where Guy established the short-term and the long-term zero-till trials he had, till he unfortunately passed away in 2013, and he had about 12, 13 years results. And so we've been able to find, like we found after 20 years, that the organic matter in the fields that were being conventionally farmed, like half summer fallow, half tillage, and had been for 100 years, that the organic matter on the hills was only about 60% of native, and on the hollows it might still be about 70%. But we've been able to get that back on the fields we had zero-tilled for 20 years. We got that back to about 90%. And now after the 40 years, we know we're actually as good or better than the native soil. Like we've been able to bring it back to that level. And the one thing that we're still convinced is that whenever we do this sampling and stuff now, we find that our topsoil is now deeper than the actual native land is. Like native land topsoil, a lot of it's only 3 or 4 inches, and then you're into the clay.
Right.
Well, we're down 6, 7 inches now with a lot of the topsoil because we've kept building it.
Yeah, that's right.
Soil.
You're not disking it and mixing it back up. You're just seeding direct into that every year.
Well, you're not disturbing it with some kind of tillage that lets it, I always described it as like a furnace, that if you open the door, everything burned up quick. So you go and open up the soil, and your organic matter, or your breakdown of your straw occurs very rapidly. Right. And disappears then. And of course, if you want a summer fall like the old days, 2 or 3 operation, the field was black. You know, like that's all that happened.
Yeah.
Whereas now, you can actually still last your stubble standing there when you're harvesting, if you go and take a look at what's in the field. So that's the difference of getting rid of the tillage part.
Yeah.
So
and the productivity that we're pulling off that land is much higher than the organic or the native, right? Like we're putting back tons more straw and organic material than what the native land would have.
Yeah,
Because we're
absolutely.
putting in nitrogen, phos, everything
Yeah,
to make.
And we know from the measurements that the university and Ag Canada have done that, we've gained in terms of the amount of nutrients released.
Yeah.
Like these short-term, long-term comparisons for a long time, it showed that we had about 60 pounds extra nitrogen being released in our long-term compared to our short-term. And if you go by the usual thinking that only about half of it's available in a year, or 30 pounds, we in effect were like having 30 pounds extra nutrients in our long-term field,
Yeah,
which is a nice bump.
yeah, for sure.
And so we got to where we don't go excessive in our nutrients in the fields we know of in long-term zero-till,
Mm-hmm.
because we know we're gonna get a release. We need moisture and we need heat, and you get release of nutrients occurring.
Yeah,
So, yes, we know we can improve these soils substantially, and we know we've got the proof that it's happened because of all these different measurements over the time, and yeah, and I can tell you that when I went to university, and I'm sure even to people going in the 1980s and 1990s, they probably were never told that we were going to be able to get this soil better than it was. I don't think anybody's been told that.
no.
But I would certainly say it's possible now with what we've seen.
Yeah,
in
yeah.
terms of the results. So, anyway, that's, and I think one of those things, and there's nobody's done trials to prove this, so it's simply my opinion. But I think that the fact that with our machine, we've always recommended going 3 to 4 inches deep with the front knife, that we get a certain amount of mixing every year, that has contributed to our deepening of the topsoil. Can't prove it, but there's a lot of other machines that do zero-till that barely go into the soil, like 1 inch to 2 inches. And I frankly don't think they're getting the same benefit we do. And another thing we learned early on a lot of soils, because I always carried a tiling spade, those ones that have a long, thin, you go into a field and you go down and you get about 2 inches down in the ground, and all of a sudden it was hard. And you go through the next 2 inches if you could wiggle and push it through,
Yeah.
and then the shovel went easily.
So it created that hard pan. And
That was a tillage hard pan that had been created with tillage over all the years with diskers and cultivators and probably rod weeders.
Right.
Everything kind of worked only in the top 2 inches, and everything below got compacted.
Well,
And then you got to get through that, because we've seen the roots of plants, and we have pictures of all this, where the roots of something like a lentil plant would just simply go sideways, and even canola will do it on the top of that hard pan.
right.
And when you fracture the ground like we do and go down the 3 to 4 inches, and your seed is up on the side, well, your roots are into the fertilizer area before the sprouts even out of the ground. We know that from
Right.
observing over all the time with it. So we don't put any fertilizer with our seed, so we have no risk with any concern that way. It's always separated, all the fertilizer goes there, but it's all available within a few days after the crop germinates.
Right.
But it gives it long enough to get there.
Well, it makes sense, because like even, talking about alkaline and stuff like that too, like the worst thing you can do is run over with disker, right? But that was a common thing. I've got this poor spot of field, so I'm gonna run over with a disker to try and, break it up. But no, that's the worst. And I've asked lots of people about that too, about what is the best for it, and that disking is not one. Because you
Well,
basically create that hard pan.
Well, you create a hard pan, but you also tend to blacken it all, which this means you can get more evaporation occurring off of it.
Mm-hmm.
And it looks good for a while,
Yeah.
but it doesn't help the soil.
No, not at all.
So it's not necessarily the way to try to solve salinity problems.
No.
So anyway, another area that I'm not sure whether you have many owners doing this, but we certainly have people that own the Conserva Pak doing it. Or the John Deere versions. that in 1994 and 95, a fellow by the name of John Deere, that some of the farmers will still remember his name because he had a lot to do with introducing the concept of banding fertilizer, and this goes back to the late 60s and early 70s. He was a classmate of mine. Unfortunately, he's passed away, but he worked in the soils area and he worked for Westco Fertilizers for years. And he contacted me in 94 and said he'd really like to see trials done with our machine with putting anhydrous ammonia on at seeding. And at that time, again, I'll call it the myth, was with anhydrous ammonia that if you went and banded it on a field, you should wait 5 days before you seed it. Like there was that much concern about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so here he was asking us to put anhydrous ammonia down here and put a seed up here all at once,
right,
and see what would happen. And so after he twisted my arm enough and I managed to find a little bit of research funding, we built a machine, a plot seeder, that could put on dry urea, or we could put on anhydrous ammonia. We had an ammonia tank on it, and of course we had to figure out how to calibrate it so that you were putting the same rates as the dry, and we basically did that with, we had load cells on the tank, and we'd set it at a certain amount and go a certain distance, and then weigh the tank and see what we'd used up and work it back to figure out how many pounds of actual nitrogen we put on. And so that got worked out, and a fellow by the name of Keith Head that I had been hiring to go and visit farmers with new machines. He had experience with anhydrous, plus he'd worked at a fertilizer dealership, and he had a master's degree in soils and was quite qualified to look after a whole machine, and we sent an operator or more with him, and we had trials in 94 and 95, and in Alberta, Westco Fertilizers looked after them after we seeded them, and in Saskatchewan, Guy Lafond and Adrian Johnson from Melfort looked after the trials here, and we did 2 years of trials. It was about 20 trials with several different crops: wheat, barley, winter wheat, canola, so on. And we essentially proved, and we used rates of 0, 50, 75, and 100 pounds of actual nitrogen put down in the different trials, all replicated, that we could safely put it on the same as urea. And we did this on a range of soils as well, because I really believe one of the main factors would be the type of soil you're on. If you had a good quality soil that could kind of take care of the ammonia,
right, yeah,
you'd be okay. But your sandy soils we were really leery about, but we used some of those and we managed to make it work. But then we showed at field days for 2 or 3 years that if you didn't have that seed separated, didn't have it over to the side and 1.5 to 2 inches above the ammonia, but you had it right above the ammonia or closer to it, you could just wipe the crop right out. Like it's that risky. So you need to know what you're putting it on with.
and making sure you have that
You have to
separation.
have that separation. You have to maintain that separation through all soil conditions that you encounter, whether it's wet or dry or whatever. And anyway, we were able to do that, and so we do have farmers that are putting ammonia on that way. A lot of others put ammonia on with mid-row banding, and of course I'm not a believer in mid-row banding at all, and that's simply because it's really evident in the dry years that your fertilizer is just too far from the seed when the seed germinates and it's dry and is not growing aggressively to get over to where the nutrients are. It's going to suffer for a long time until you finally maybe get moisture or conditions that let your crop get to the fertilizer. So, I mean, mid-row banding is certainly a safe way to put ammonia on. I just don't think it works on a lot of soils. It may work on some soils, but...
Well, and like you say, it's kind of one of those things, like, I mean, over the last, 3-4 years, we've been drier. to me, like I said, out in the field, that's really when the difference in seeders is showing up. You know, like I said, the difference between our FlexiQuil with a C shank versus something with a pair link. Like you go into the field and that crop is tabletop, like whether it's seedling or whatever, versus like our C shank where, you know, we might get plant kind of scattered, but just that distribution and you know, in a normal year, I don't know when we'll ever get one of those, but a normal year with decent moisture, you know, it'd probably be, I would think, probably pretty hard to see a difference between emergence that way if you've got adequate moisture. But I know on these dry years, you can tell a difference between cedar types.
Yeah, well, that's when definitely the differences show up. I mean, if you get rain, it covers up lots of mistakes.
That's right, yeah.
Anyway, it's an option, and of course, a lot of other people, you know, in the early days, there was hardly any liquid fertilizer around either, and then that spread, and of course, a lot of people are using that as well now, and it's certainly a much safer form of fertilizer. You just have to handle large volumes of product.
Mm-hmm.
And the only comment I've ever heard there, we've used all the fertilizers during all these years because we were going to sell them, we were going to use them ourselves.
Right, yeah.
And we know that we've got conditions, if it's going to be a problem, it will be, because like I said, we got some land that's pretty near 100% sand in areas, and you're going to have problems there if you're going to have problems anywhere with fertilizer damage to germination.
Right, yeah.
So we have tried that, and I'd seen that in way back in 1983 when I first started to see the results. So
Mm-hmm.
fortunately, we had those places to go to because
Yeah,
they show
that's right.
you things real quick, and it's not hard to understand what went on.
No. No, and it's funny, like I said, even with the high sand stuff, I remember, so when I was younger, Dad built a 20 by 30 sandbox for us. So when I got older, to whatever, 5 or 6, I grew crops in it. That was my farm. It was
Oh,
there.
okay.
And the one year I put wheat or barley in, but I didn't fertilize, and I could not get this crop to grow. Watered it and everything, couldn't get it, or it would come up and it was just garbage. So then I remember I took a pail of fertilizer from the farm, phos and nitrogen, I think I took, and doused it. And I remember Dad coming home one day and he's like, "This looks better than our farm," and it's pure sad. But it just goes to show you know, you get the right thing where it needs it and do it and play around.
I got one burning question. So,
Okay.
lots of what I deal with now, and we're seeing more and more is like stratification of nutrients in the soil, right? Especially over those long-term no-till fields, like so phosphorus and potassium is kind of sitting at that first 3 inches and then not below, just because of repeated fertilization right here, right? And then a straw being spread on the surface and then the potassium staying on top. And so a lot of people have been looking at considering like a tillage every once in a while, just to mix it all up.
Mhm.
And then the other thing a lot of people consider a tillage is for that hard pan. So, and like establishing that hard pan, and they want to break that up. So I get tons of questions about, can I till just this once? I just want to mix it up, or I want to break up that hard pan, because all of this fertilizer is right in those top 2 inches, and then that dries out, and the plant can't get any of it. So I guess what's your thoughts on fields where we run into that situation?
Like I said, we wouldn't, with the Conserva Pak design and what John Deere's selling, of course, we wouldn't suggest you need the tillage because you're getting some every year.
Yeah.
Because we're down, like I said, we recommend 3 to 4 inches in depth with the front opener. So we knew that broke that tillage hard pan up, and we think we're getting a mixing of soil in that area.
Yeah.
Every year, even though it's only every 12 inches.
Yeah.
But over time, you're going to, do it across the field. It's an interesting problem and may be a real problem, but it's going to need somebody that's going to do some serious research to prove what you need to do and whether it needs to be a problem or not. And frankly, I'd like to see the research done, because I think a lot of people are not achieving the results that they should get with zero tillage. Because for various reasons like you've mentioned and others, I don't think they're getting all the benefits they could get. And you've mentioned the dry years showing it, and we've really seen it the last 3 years. And we've got some crops that I consider just amazing for the limited moisture the last 3 years. You know, that with the system and but whether anybody will ever really do the research, I know a lot of companies will discourage it, because some of their machines don't go in very far, and I think that they are probably leaving everything at that shallow level. And it's part of the reason. I mean, for a long time there was research done, and it was done with our machine. Guy Lafon did some of it. He did some of probably the latest with our machines that I know of. But he compared putting phosphate with the seedo, you know, right with the seed, or putting it all down here, in right in the band below. And he found virtually no difference over a series of years. And it's not surprising at all to me, because as I explained, if you dig up a plant when it's germinating, before you'll see the sprout out of the ground, the roots are down to the fertilizer. So why do you need any fertilizer with the seed? You know, and you don't want any with the seed, or you don't want excessive amounts with the seed, because it all hurts germination, or can hurt germination. So, so then you take that principle, if you accept that that actually happens, that it can cause germination problems. So you say, well, where am I going to put it? Well, if you go and move it a long ways away from the seed, it's going to be a long time, because phosphorus doesn't move till your roots get over and find it. If it's 5 inches away, that's a long time. And when you've got a crop that's struggling to grow, when it's dry, and you get on the knolls where it's poorer soil and doesn't have natural nutrients that your, say, your clay soils have, or your productive areas of loam soils. So, like I said, I think there are problems that people possibly have, but who's ever going to do the work to actually find it out? I'm quite, quite convinced there's differences could be found. And it may only be in certain years. Like if you get a normally productive year, regular moisture and everything else, a lot of these things won't show up the same. It's when you get stress conditions on the crop. So.
Well, that's the prime point, right? Like, in a normal year where we have adequate moisture and spring moisture and rain, none of these problems really cause a big issue, because the water's helping out, the plant is growing faster and everything else. Like I said, a lot of our problems are showing up in these drier years, which is, frankly, it's putting everything to the test these last couple of years to see what's going on. And it's funny too, because I was talking to Richard on Sunday, I guess, and we were just talking about that. Like, you know, a lot of the research out there is older research. Like, there hasn't been really new research with newer machines, right? Like, whether it's fertilizer rates or certain trials and stuff like that. Like, there hasn't been, nothing's really been retested in the last 10 years.
I think that stratification problem, I mean, it only shows up in dry years for now. Same thing with, I mean, the zero till, or the conventional tillage. It's a problem that gets worse and worse and worse and worse the longer we keep doing it. So I mean, the longer we only place fertilizer an inch and a half down, I mean, 10 years from now we have another dry spell. It's going to be a little bit worse, right? A little bit worse. So it's something that needs to be dealt with, I think, to
yeah, I think you probably identified something that probably is an issue. And like I said, we don't think we have that problem. Now we pretty well all the time are putting fertilizer somewhere between 3 and 4 inches deep. And we put everything there: nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, anything else, potash if we add it, you know. But I think the fact that we are deeper in the ground than the real shallow stuff, that I think is where you could have a problem. And,
Yeah.
But when it comes to looking, to me, at overall fertilization around crops, like the major driver of the soil improvement and growing better crops is still probably nitrogen, is the one. And it all depends on the history of how people have farmed using phosphorus. Like back 20 years ago, 20 to 30 years ago, there was a lot of land that hadn't received even much phosphorus for a long time. And when he did trials at our place, and he had what he called short term, which was the land we'd taken over in 2001, I think it was, compared to the land that we'd farmed with zero-till for over 20 years by then. He found some very interesting comparisons because he had replicated trials and he used certain levels of nitrogen on plots, and those plots always received the same level of nitrogen. So he had plots at 0, 30, 60, 90, 120 pounds, but it always received the same amount. And he found out also on other trials with phosphorus that our land that had been sort of getting regular amounts, but not extremely high amounts of phosphorus, that that land actually went for 2 or 3 years where the zero rate of phosphorus was as good as some of the other rates. But the short term, it went about 1 year and then they were in trouble. Like the yields just dropped off. You know, and like I said, again, he was using it where he was using 0 every year or 30 every year or whatever rates he was using. And that's when it showed up that obviously previous history made quite a difference. And we have, I would say, never used as high a rates as a lot of people have. And that's because we've learned from some of these trials that the university have done. And they've taken soil samples and they take them back to the labs in Saskatoon and evaluate the amount of nutrients that are released over, say, a 6-week period. They look at them every week. And they can tell there how many nutrients are being released over a period of time, which is an indicator of what you're going to be getting in the field too over a period of time. And we've seen there where we typically get this about extra actual available 30 pounds of nitrogen that the other fields don't get. So on that account, when people might choose to go over 100 pounds of nitrogen, maybe to 120 in growing canola, like we'll stop at 85 or 90 pounds applied, just because we've seen this result. So there may also be room for people getting testing done in the future of soil samples and looking at that release, and maybe it's available now, I don't know. Because I've always been a believer in the fact that you fertilize for what you think the crop's going to take, you know, as much as for just what's in the soil, because, in other words, to try to stay at least even, you know, and not be running it downhill. Yeah. They used to always compare it to a bank account, so trying to keep it at least stable. Yeah. So.
Yeah, and just making sure that you're adding, you know, at least, or replacing it, basically, making sure that you're topping up what's being taken out of it.
Yeah. So yeah, then the other thing, whether in the zero-till, whether it's ever going to come to pass or not, the talk about whether farmers should get credits for storing carbon in the soil. Well, we know that we are storing carbon. We know that there's more there than there was originally because of the trials we've had, where there is a native comparison. Now, there isn't many native comparisons around, and so a lot of people don't have that availability, but it's proven to be an interesting thing from a perspective of the fact that we actually could take those soils back beyond what they originally were. And there should be no trouble maintaining them there. And as far as we're concerned, and it would need to be measured and proven, but we think we're still adding every year. Because a lot of the theory is that you only sort of rebuild the soil to a certain level and that's the end of it. Then it may take certain crops to be able to help you do that. Something that will root deeper and help you develop soil deeper. But I think there's still a lot to be learned about zero-till. And I think, unfortunately, in some respects related to the agronomics and the soils, that a lot of people think, oh, we've got to the level and that's it. I think there's still ways to improve it. And, you know, we've already discussed some today about your stratification issue of phosphorus, and it's not that difficult to evaluate it, but somebody needs to do that and needs to think there's enough value in doing it. You know, and unfortunately, I hear when I talk to university people, and you people would maybe know this better than I would, but I understand that there's sort of less interest in the soil part of university training than there is in a lot of the other areas nowadays. Now, I don't know if it's true or not, but I've heard that. And I know the fellow that was down that did the soil sampling at our place a couple falls ago. I worked with him all day doing it. He was indicating that there wasn't a lot of students, and there is a lot of students in total in agriculture, but not as many are going into the soils area. And I would certainly, hopefully, encourage people to go into that, because I think it will be the area that still opens up. But like, yeah, we've learned how to protect the soil. You know, we know that, but how can we get greater productivity out of it without necessarily spending a lot, but doing just the right things? I think there's still room to be gained. And my background is not any of those. It's ag economics. And I spent, from 1983, when I first came up with a system that would work, till 1989, 6 years, building a new version that was trying to improve it every year and trying to avoid getting into manufacturing. But in 89, nobody could see a future in zero-till. Like, none of the main companies were there. In fact, it's very interesting that I'd been told this by Vic Bolio, who was our former ag rep and I used to work with in the winter months. He says, yeah, it usually takes about 25 years for the main companies to get into it. And if you go way back, he would use the example of the introduction of deep tillage cultivators, which was a heavier version of cultivators, but had never been around till like probably the 40s or 50s. It took about 25 years for them to be adopted. Well, it was just about 25 years exactly from when we came up with the system that we had before John Deere bought it. So I didn't realize that until I thought back. But and there's a logic to it from their point of view, and don't blame John Deere for it. It's smart management, because they don't want to be into something and have to develop it all and go through all that may not work in the end, and they want to be into the market when there's already a market and a sizable market that's growing, that they can see is growing. And you can certainly tell that when the 2 years we worked with John Deere, when they bought the technology, and then we built for them for 2 years all their machines that went out to Western Canada and even shipped to Australia and other places, the same as we had been doing. They just simply wanted to get into the market when they were there. Some of their engineering people weren't that happy that they hadn't developed it and so on, but they ended up taking our complete technology pretty much of the seeder, the opener system, which they really wanted, but they found they didn't have a frame to put it on, so they needed our frame, so they went along with that. And one of the most interesting things is they are still building that same frame design as well as the opener design today. which is the frame design has been around since 1987. The basics of certainly it's wider and so on. They did build their own frame design for a 76 foot, you know, but they kept the opener in that case still the same. So, so that's why you don't want to look to those companies to develop really innovative new things. They're going to get into the market when there's a market there, and you can't blame them.
No.
So,
Yeah, that's interesting.
yeah, well, it's the way it's just the way it works, and you got to realize that it makes sense to them.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, that's cool.
yeah,
Yeah, there's just, I don't know, yeah, there's just a lot of history there that's like unknown, like I said, for our generation. I mean, we basically came in when zero till was already proven. It's a thing. It's, you know, you see with this, you see with Anhydrous, a lot of cultivator, you see, you know, a lot of that was already proven. So it's good to look back and see where did it develop from, why, and what led to it, kind of thing. And like luckily for me, like, you know, I worked with iHeart for 7 years. So like even for me, I had the privilege of working with Guillaume Fawn and Bill May and Chris and Christiane and those people, and for me personally, like, I learned a lot that I was able to do, and even today, like with some of the stuff we do, like us doing trials with growers and stuff like that, and yeah, I love it because you get to test products and test things and prove them wrong or prove them right, one of the two. And no, that's what I enjoy.
And I think from the whole story that our generation doesn't really know what to take from is don't accept the norm as the best, right? Like it took 25 years for John Deere to take it on, right? To just because we're doing what we're doing right now isn't how it's been always done isn't necessarily how it should be done, or isn't always the best, or just question everything kind of thing, right? And keep learning and
well, something else, if you talk about the evolution of learning and so on, that I could point out that, and some people may recognize it, even in the earlier generation, but we actually learned a lot from selling into Australia. And the reason for that is they have conditions that we don't have here. And in a lot of cases, I always tell farmers, if you're complaining about the land you're farming and so on, I said, go take a trip to West Australia or South Australia, and you'll come back and be very happy with what you got, because they farm some terrible soils. But we learned over there because we had to make our machines adapt to those conditions. And for example, the openers that we had on our machines, we went there within 2 to 3 years of the first machines. We sold our first machines to Australia in 1993 and started to go there. I would go there pretty near once a year, but this Keith Head I mentioned, he'd been over there more than I was even. And being a soils person, he recognized things. And the first thing was that the openers that we had that we used in this country, you know, people used as banding knives and so on, and would last probably 2 or 3, 4,000 acres. They wouldn't last 500 acres over there. Like they just wear them right out. And in fact, when we went over and did testing, we went up and down in what was a sheep patch, but they were going to crop it the next year because that's just the way they do things. And we wore 2 inches off of the knives we had, which had a nigh-hard face, which early people will remember came before carbides. And we wore 2 inches off in a total of 6 miles of driving. You'd go a half mile down the field and stop, and we'd take pictures and so on, but you couldn't put your hand on it, it was so hot. And like it was just burning it off, like you had a grindstone against it. And so we had carbides on that same frame, and of course they were lasting and lasting. We got to where the carbide design that we came up with, because we had various versions of that, we've had people in Australia now seed 10,000 acres in a season with our openers, you know, So we learned that. We learned about putting larger tires on frames, so we had literally truck tires. Over there they use even bigger, but that became popular here. We used to offer the regular implement tire, they were called, and the big tires. Well, within a couple of years, nobody wanted the implement tires. They all wanted big ones in this country. And it's definitely an advantage. And unfortunately, John Deere's gone back to a lower profile tire, which is not as good if you get wet conditions as what we have done with the large tire. And then the concept on the hydraulics that we developed where we have a separate pressure for the seed opener, or for the fertilizer opener first, and a separate one for the seed opener packer wheel part. Well, the actual system with an accumulator creating the pressure rather than live hydraulics, that was all introduced in Australia, except we introduced the idea of using 2 of them on every machine. And everybody, you know, my thought originally when I saw it was, who wants all those little cylinders, because they all have a potential to leak? Well, after we developed it and got the right rings and stuff inside and seals, we've had next to no problems with them. Because it's just a matter of getting the right technology in it. We didn't have to use that higher pressure, and it's just very simple. And then the benefit to the farmer is he isn't running live hydraulics all the time, that he needs to run his opener system to keep it in the ground and to lift it out of the ground. We don't have that. And at the same time, the farmer is trying to run 1 or 2 fans with hydraulics. And so people have had to go to new tractors with big hydraulic capacity because they can't operate their machines otherwise. And we didn't have to do that. So like I said, we got convinced because of what we saw and how we could adapt it into our machine. That's essentially what John Deere's got now, is our last version of opener design. And it had to really prove the test of time over there in terms of the whole frame design, because a farmer over there with, say, a 56-foot seeder, which we were building at that time, farmers here will seed 5,000 or 6,000 acres in a year, because we are constrained by the length of time in the spring we've got the seed. Well, a farmer over there would seed 20,000 acres with that same machine. So 3 times as much. Well, in 10 years, they have 200,000 acres on a machine. You learn an awful lot about the frame and everything else, you know, in terms of what you have to do to make it withstand. And so when you talk about evolution of learning and so on, we were fortunate because of that. And we sold a lot of machines over there in a lot of different conditions, so we got that opportunity too.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I just got to experience different, like you say, a variety of different testing that you guys did was pretty cool.
Yeah.
And seeing different things happen. But, well, like you said, with the you know, adopting new technologies, for some it's a scary thing, because you don't want to be the guy that came up with this thing to be more so at the coffee shops, right? Like, to be made fun of, but you kind of push that aside and be like, no, this is legit. This is interesting. But I guess with that, well, thanks again, Jim, for allowing us to do this. This is pretty cool. Like I said, with, you know, for me, it's more personal because, like I said, Grandpa being involved and everything else, and everything. It's interesting, pretty good. So, no, I really appreciate the time and glad we could do this.
Good. Well, it's been interesting to think about it again, and I've got a bit of materials I'll leave you with that actually a lot of them were developed quite a long time ago, but if you read them, I don't think you'll find they're too far out of what we're thinking about today too. So anyway, it was kind of our evolution of our learning and what we passed on to people at that time, and certainly in the early days we had to go to meetings and just talk about a basic system that was way different than what people were using at that time. So
for sure, yeah.
It was an interesting evolution, as well as the equipment that was needed to go with it.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
No, awesome. Yeah, well, thanks again.
Good.